The blood marriage ceremonies Vikings imposed on conquered women were more inhuman than you imagine in the sacred groves where ancient oaks cast shadows darker than the northern nights, where stone altars bore witness to rituals that predated Christian memory. There occurred wedding ceremonies so grotesque and brutal that they transformed the most fundamental human institution into an instrument of systematic terror and spiritual destruction. These were not the marriage rites celebrated in saga halls or remembered in romantic verse, but blood-soaked rituals that bound conquered women to their captors through ceremonies designed to obliterate their previous identities while creating spiritual unions that trapped them in bonds more inescapable than iron chains. The screams that echoed through these sacred spaces during these forced matrimonial rites revealed the true depths of Viking cruelty, as they weaponized the sacred act of marriage itself into a tool of conquest more devastating than any sword or spear. This is the investigation into the systematic practice of forced blood marriage ceremonies imposed upon conquered women by Viking raiders, rituals that reveal how Norse spiritual beliefs and legal traditions were deliberately corrupted to create forms of matrimonial bondage that served both religious and military purposes in the subjugation of conquered populations. Through examination of archaeological evidence from ritual sites across Scandinavia, contemporary accounts from both Norse and Christian sources, analysis of runic inscriptions that document these ceremonies, legal codes governing forced matrimonial practices, and the physical evidence preserved in ceremonial artifacts and burial remains, we uncover the horrifying truth about marriage rituals that transformed sacred vows into instruments of systematic dehumanization. Today, we explore the deliberate corruption of Norse marriage traditions to create ceremonies of forced union that served multiple strategic purposes in Viking conquest strategy, examining the ritual elements that distinguished these blood marriages from legitimate Norse matrimonial practices, the spiritual beliefs that justified these brutal ceremonies, the long-term legal and social consequences for their victims, and the psychological warfare aspects of forcing conquered women to participate in sacred rituals that violated their deepest religious and cultural convictions. Drawing upon evidence from excavated ritual sites in Iceland, Norway, and Denmark, along with analysis of ceremonial weapons, marriage artifacts, and the specialized altar stones used in these forced ceremonies, we reveal how Viking religious culture developed sophisticated mechanisms for transforming military conquest into spiritual domination through the systematic perversion of marriage itself. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age ritual sites reveals specialized ceremonial infrastructure specifically designed for conducting forced marriage ceremonies that required both the physical restraint of unwilling participants and the performance of elaborate spiritual rituals that legitimized these unions within Norse religious and legal frameworks. Excavations at sites like Gamla, Uppsala, and Trelleborg show evidence of modified altar complexes that included restraint systems, drainage channels for ritual blood collection, and specialized ceremonial chambers where conquered women could be held during the extended ritual processes that preceded these forced marriages. The discovery of ceremonial marriage artifacts bearing runic inscriptions that explicitly reference conquest and subjugation indicates that Viking communities invested considerable artistic and religious resources in creating material culture that celebrated and sanctified these brutal matrimonial practices. The timing and structure of blood marriage ceremonies were carefully integrated into the broader rhythms of Viking military campaigns and religious observances, with specific seasonal festivals and post-conquest celebrations providing occasions for mass matrimonial rituals that could involve dozens of conquered women in simultaneous ceremonies designed to demonstrate Norse spiritual authority over conquered populations. Contemporary legal codes from Iceland and Norway contain detailed provisions governing the conduct of these forced marriages, including specific requirements for ritual elements that would ensure their validity within Norse legal tradition, while creating binding obligations that trap their victims in permanent servitude disguised as legitimate matrimonial unions. The religious dimensions of these blood marriage ceremonies drew upon ancient Norse spiritual beliefs about the relationship between conquest, fertility, and divine favor, with the forced union of conquered women serving as both thanksgiving offerings to war gods and ritual mechanisms for ensuring the spiritual incorporation of conquered territories into Norse religious and cultural systems. Runic inscriptions from ceremonial sites explicitly connect these matrimonial rituals to the worship of Odin and Freyr, suggesting that Viking religious authorities viewed the systematic forced marriage of conquered women as sacred activities that strengthened the spiritual bonds between Norse communities and their patron deities while demonstrating divine approval of military expansion. The ceremonial elements that distinguished blood marriages from legitimate Norse matrimonial practices included ritual bloodletting from both the conquered woman and her captor, the deliberate desecration of religious symbols associated with the woman's previous faith, and the performance of binding oaths that were designed to create spiritual obligations that extended beyond the immediate ceremony to encompass the woman's entire future existence and any children born from the forced union. Contemporary accounts from Christian chroniclers describe these ceremonies as blasphemous parodies of legitimate marriage rites that incorporated elements specifically chosen to violate the religious convictions of Christian captives while creating binding spiritual obligations within Norse pagan tradition. The psychological warfare aspects of these forced marriage ceremonies included deliberate timing that coincided with Christian holy days or significant dates from the captive's previous cultural calendar, creating scenarios where participation in blood marriage rituals required the explicit renunciation of previous religious beliefs and the active participation in ceremonies that violated everything the women had previously considered sacred. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with these ceremonies shows clear signs of Christian religious artifacts that were deliberately incorporated into pagan marriage rituals in ways designed to maximize the spiritual trauma experienced by conquered Christian women. The legal frameworks that governed blood marriage ceremonies created complex systems of matrimonial bondage that went far beyond simple sexual slavery to encompass complete legal and social incorporation into Norse family structures that granted husbands absolute authority over their conquered wives while providing legal justifications for their ongoing abuse and exploitation. Medieval Icelandic law codes contain detailed provisions governing the property rights, inheritance obligations, and social status of women married through these forced ceremonies, revealing how Viking legal tradition was modified to accommodate and legitimize what were essentially ritualized forms of permanent kidnapping and sexual slavery. The seasonal timing of major military campaigns created periods when blood marriage ceremonies occurred on massive scales, with the return of successful raiding expeditions providing occasions for community-wide matrimonial festivals that could involve hundreds of conquered women in simultaneous ceremonies that served both as victory celebrations and as demonstrations of Norse cultural dominance over conquered populations. Contemporary accounts describe these mass matrimonial events as extending over multiple days and involving entire communities in ritual activities that combined religious observance with systematic sexual violence disguised as legitimate marriage ceremony. The international scope of these forced marriage practices created networks of matrimonial bondage that connected Viking settlements across vast geographic areas, with women captured in Ireland finding themselves bound to men in Iceland, while captives from England were transported to Norway for incorporation into blood marriage ceremonies that served to strengthen political and military alliances between different Norse communities through the systematic distribution of conquered women as matrimonial prizes. The resistance strategies employed by women facing blood marriage ceremonies took forms that reflected both their desperation to avoid spiritual violation and their understanding that survival often required some form of compliance with ceremony requirements, leading to complex negotiations between captors and captives about ritual modifications that might preserve some elements of the women's religious convictions while satisfying Norse requirements for legitimate matrimonial union. Legal codes contain specific provisions for punishing various forms of resistance to blood marriage ceremonies, including escalated ritual requirements that increased the spiritual violation experienced by women who initially refused to participate willingly in the ceremonial proceedings. The medical evidence preserved in skeletal remains from women buried in contexts associated with blood marriage ceremonies provides stark testimony to the systematic nature of the abuse they endured both during the initial rituals and throughout their subsequent married lives, with patterns of injuries that reveal not only the violence of the ceremonies themselves, but the ongoing physical trauma of matrimonial bondage that continued until death. Bone analysis shows evidence of specific types of ritualistic scarring and mutilation that appear to have been ceremonial requirements of blood marriage rituals, along with signs of chronic abuse that suggest these marriages involved systematic, ongoing violence rather than stabilizing into more conventional domestic arrangements. The children born from blood marriage unions occupied particularly complex positions within Norse society, as their mixed heritage made them both symbols of successful conquest and potential sources of identity conflict that could threaten the stability of the matrimonial bondage systems that had produced them. Legal codes reveal detailed frameworks for determining the inheritance rights and social status of children born from these forced marriages, with provisions that typically granted them full Norse citizenship while severing any legal connection to their mother's original cultures or communities. The role of Norse women in blood marriage ceremonies reveals complex dynamics of complicity and resistance within Viking society, as the wives and daughters of Norse warriors were often required to participate in ritual activities that helped conduct these forced matrimonial ceremonies while potentially competing with conquered women for household resources and social status. Archaeological evidence suggests that legitimate Norse wives sometimes played active roles in the subjugation and abuse of women married through blood marriage ceremonies, creating complex hierarchies of oppression within Viking household structures. The gradual transformation of blood marriage practices during the Christianization of Scandinavia created hybrid ceremonial forms that attempted to satisfy both Norse traditional requirements and emerging Christian matrimonial standards, leading to modified rituals that maintain the coercive aspects of forced marriage while incorporating Christian religious elements that provided new justifications for the ongoing bondage of conquered women within supposedly legitimate matrimonial unions. The documentation of these ceremonies in saga literature and legal text required sophisticated forms of euphemistic language that could preserve accurate historical records of forced marriage practices while presenting them within heroic narratives that celebrated Norse military achievement rather than focusing on the systematic abuse of conquered women. Literary analysis reveals how seemingly romantic accounts of Viking marriages often contained coded descriptions of blood marriage ceremonies that allowed the brutal realities of these practices to be preserved for posterity within officially sanctioned cultural narratives. The international diplomatic consequences of blood marriage practices included their use as tools of political negotiation, with Viking leaders sometimes offering to conduct legitimate marriage ceremonies for high-status captured women in exchange for territorial concessions or tribute payments from their original communities, creating complex negotiations that balanced individual rescue against broader political and military considerations. The legacy of blood marriage ceremonies extended far beyond their immediate victims to influence the development of European matrimonial law and religious doctrine in ways that created new legal frameworks for determining the validity of marriages contracted under duress, while establishing precedents that would affect the treatment of women in conquest situations for centuries to come. As we examine these blood marriage ceremonies imposed upon conquered women, we confront perhaps the most disturbing example of how sacred human institutions can be systematically corrupted to serve military and political purposes, transforming marriage itself into a weapon of conquest that created forms of bondage more complete and inescapable than simple slavery or captivity. The story of women forced into blood marriage ceremonies reminds us that the systematic abuse of fundamental human institutions like marriage has served throughout history as one of the most effective tools of cultural destruction and psychological domination, creating forms of trauma that extend far beyond individual victims to encompass entire communities and cultures that were forced to witness the desecration of their most sacred traditions and relationships.